Hello and welcome to the Mobile Gamedev Playbook. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. This is a podcast all about what makes a great mobile game, what is and isn't working for mobile game designers, and all the latest trends. I'm your host, Jon Jordan, and joining me today we have a packed podcast, and we're going to be going deep into the latest release from Anno Games. So let's go to our experts from Anno Games. Great to have you with us. So we have Thi Detert, who is the senior lead game designer. How's it going?
I'm good, John. Thanks.
Good. And we also have Alison Simpson, who is the product owner. How's it going, Alison?
It's great. Thanks for having us.
Good. And you are both working on Sunrise Village, so that is the focus of our podcast today. Talk a little bit about the concepts and how it's gone through in development and soft launch and all that stuff, and into launch as well. And providing the 1,000-mile view, as ever, is Teemu Palomäki. How's it going, Teemu?
It's going great. Great to be here with you.
Good. So you're going to be our our headline expert for sort of crafting games, and Thi and Alison talk specifically about what's been going on in that game. Maybe to kick us off, maybe it'd be good to get a little sort of introduction to Anno Games. I mean, pretty well known, but maybe some people who are listening to it don't know. So can we have a little potted history of Anno Games?
Yeah, sure, John. InnoGames is based in Hamburg, Germany. It was founded in 2007 and is actually still run by the original founders today. The company is about over 400 employees strong, with people coming from all over the world, including the Americas like myself, all over Europe, Asia. So it's really cool to be in such a really diverse company. And even with the rather big size of the company, it's still really focused on having a very open and collaborative environment. So like something you would see in a startup. And since I worked in startups quite a lot in San Francisco, back in San Francisco here, I really appreciated that part of InnoGames. But yeah, you may have heard of some of our more well-known games, like Forge of Empires, Elvenar, Tribal Wars, to name a few, all of which were very strategy, city builder type games. But as you know, we're moving into other genres now, and had two successful commercial launches this past year. One with Rise of Cultures, and of course, our very own Sunrise Village.
Yeah, I guess I've played a few of the games in my time, and I guess without being pejorative, it was a very I think when it started out, a very German developer, so very sort of German sort of PC style sort of strategy games, and really quite deep, but actually successfully made the move to mobile. Has been doing very well on mobile, and I guess the full progression now is to be doing a sort of a more sort of farming simulator adventure game, which is what we have with Sunrise Village. So where did the idea actually come from? So is it just a natural progression that you start off with very hardcore sort of games that tend to be more played by sort of teenage and young male players, and then sort of over time you sort of go, well, let's make games for a more general audience? What's the thinking internally?
So, like you mentioned, we've already got a lot of experience at InnoGames with strategy titles and city building simulation titles. Sunrise Village, well, we initially wanted to create a simulation title, but also using our own experience from InnoGames. So the city building elements, you do have them in Sunrise Village, in the village area, but we also wanted to introduce some new elements and reach a new target audience with the farming and more of the resource management style of gameplay. So that's what we did. And then, to really add a sort of little bit of a Sunrise Village spin on it, we wanted to make the most of the character. So we've got a very heavy focus on the character gameplay. And as we went through development, we found that, we wanted to increase the focus on the character gameplay. So we added an extensive quest system and an extensive story. And that's where the exploration really sort of took off. And we found that this was actually really compelling in terms of gameplay, in terms of, goals and motivation for the player. And so we carried on with that, and that's what ultimately became Sunrise Village.
So that's sort of interesting as you spoke about that there. I guess me having not made games, I sort of get the idea that some developers sit down and they go, right, this is what we're going to make, and then they sort of work away for a certain period of time to come up with the sort of vision that they had. But what you were suggesting was much more sort of, well, we sort of come up with an idea, and then we sort of use some of our expertise, but then over time the thing's actually quite fluid, and you come up with something, I guess, that you broadly sort of thought, but maybe some of the specifics are not what you originally thought. So I mean, I guess Thi, as the designer with the designer hat on, was that sort of the process? I mean, how did that sort of flow from? I don't know if you have an original sort of vision document, whether those things sort of exist anymore, but how did it sort of flow through the process?
Alison mentioned we have a lot of experience with the quest systems and a lot of in our other games. So I was on a previous game at InnoGames before at Forge of Empires, and there we used like a lot of quests, a lot of storytelling, and we kind of brought that over here. And with the character-centric gameplay, we were able to delve deeper into that and even create now, like within the game, the story is being unfolded through levels, and the player can explore and uncover the story slowly, and we're trying to make this really compelling. We introduce this sort of mystical element to make players, kind of hook players in and try to make them want to figure out what's going on. So it's uncovering the story is now the player's main goal, and that's sort of developed along with the city building expertise that we have, the quest building expertise that we have, and it kind of developed into that.
And with my equally inexperienced hat on, a game like Sunrise Village, I guess, was interesting to me. It was surprising from Anno Games, because Anno Games, as I said, has generally been sort of a male-focused game. And obviously, you two people coming on the podcast are women, which we don't have all the time in sort of in game development circles. So was this another overt thing where you said, we just want to make this more accessible, or was it a bit more like, we definitely want this to appeal to women? Or how does that sort of gender sort of aspect come into play when you're designing and thinking about product?
Well, InnoGames does have another established title, Elvenar, which is, it does appeal more to a female audience than a male audience, even though it is still, you could say, technically a more strategy city builder title. But we did make a conscious decision also when we were looking at expanding our audience. We know we do have like a very strong male audience already at InnoGames, and when we were talking about the farming simulation genre, you can see that this naturally seems to appeal more to women, and we built on that. So we geared our game in that direction, and Sunrise Village was the result.
Obviously, it could be enjoyed by all genders. So let's let's knock that one on the head. Okay, so Teemu, coming in with your sort of expert view over the entire ecosystem. I mean, what's sort of been going on in that? I mean, I don't know if that's sort of a genre, the sort of farming simulator narrative. There's quite a lot of sort of features and sort of genres and subgenres sort of packed into there, which, as we've discussed, is sort of where game design is at the moment. People aren't making pure single genres as much as they used to. It's all now very much sort of layered and different sort of gameplay and different metas in there. I mean, what's been going on over the last year in that sort of area?
If we look at the tycoon crafting games, there's like two specific sets of crafting games. There's the type that is, say, Heyday and Township, where you just focus on the farm, and then there's the Sunrise Village type of games that has also the exploration and more like story and uncovering the world, and those are kind of two different but still within the same subgenre. But when looking at it whole, the top games, they bringing like social aspects lately, and then also like keeping players motivated to keep coming back to the game. That's something that differentiates the top games and the subgenre in general. Say can be like subscriptions that people get really invested in the game, or the magic word paddle pass always works, or then just like periodical gifts that if you come during the week, you get like weekly rewards, and those are some of the differentiating features within these crafting games.
So with a designer hat on, Thi, how did I guess it probably wasn't just you. Obviously, all these things are sort of a team efforts. But in terms of the design sort of phase, how did you start thinking about sort of what you wanted to do? Was it obvious that you were going to have sort of crafting and exploration and story? Was that sort of, you had that as a sort of a core of what you were going to do, or was was one more prominent in the beginning than the others? Because it strikes me, not being a designer, but there are some of those sort of types of types of gameplay associated with some of those elements don't necessarily link together in a sort of coherent way all the time. So how did you think about that, and where did that sort of progress as you got into the sort of production?
So, I mean, of course, we settled on doing a farm simulation. I mean, there's a large market for that, right? So, I mean, when you're a game designer, you do look at competitor games too to pull in there what they're doing, what maybe is working for them. But I mean, for us, going into simulation, we had city builders before. We kind of really pulled from that. The knowledge was really transferable there. And a trend that, we're seeing is that in the market now, you have games that are kind of merging genres. So you have a lot of games that are like, match three, but with something else attached to it to kind of extend that gameplay. And it was just a good space for us to get into. Like again, going back into the story aspect, we have a lot of experience with that, and like, why not make that more immersive for the player? Why not make the simulation side just maybe half of the game, but the other half and is this huge like like a lot of content created from us, but like for the player, it's just some stuff that they can continue to discover, which is quite different from all the games that we have, which is pretty static. You have sometimes content releases, but in the end, you're focused mainly in your base, your home base, your city, and whatever it might be. But yeah, so I think that's how it just kind of developed for us.
As you say that, it sort of does strike me that, as you say, sort of there's sort of game where we'll talk about live ops, but there's sort of game where sort of you have limited events and sort of drops, or maybe certain items that are available for certain periods of time, and that drives sort of usage. But narrative, any games with narrative are sort of it's much harder to do, as you sort of alluded to there. That's a lot of work to create narrative, and you can't just it's not just sort of, let's create some items and someone quickly write a story about it. I mean, it has to be much more thought through, and If a certain bit of it's polished, and the rest of it has to sort of be the same polish, you can't just sort of like, suddenly just sort of knock something off. So, Alison, how does it work from that point of view? Because I'm guessing that from a production point of view, the narrative bit of it just takes sort of a lot longer, and probably has a lot more people looking at it and making sure that's right. Is that the case? And how did you sort of work on those two sort of different types of production sort of cadences?
Yeah, I mean, the story, yes, it does take a lot of work, and I think game designer are also very, very heavily involved in the story writing process. And game designer currently actually, working with the narrative designer that we're also working with to create the story that players are really, really enjoying.
Do you run out of story, or with like meta, the meta just goes on and on and on. You sort of level up, and there's more things to find. But a story tends to be more linear.
Well, no, we don't run out of story. When we created the concept for Sunrise Village, we also designed kind of the story, and we have this overarching story that runs throughout the entire thread of the game. And this is not going to end. So we have the kind of first stopping point where we might wrap up like not the first chapter, but perhaps the first version of the story, or the first book in the story, and then we'll move on to more, because I think there's always more for the players to explore. I think we've got a really vast world there that we've created. We've got some light fantasy elements in there as well, to really give us room to explore more unique elements of story, magical elements, for example. So I think there's still a very, very long way for us to go in terms of the story.
Talked a bit about, I suppose, the sort of thinking about the design and maybe pre-production. How long did that sort of period take? And when you enter sort of production, so when people are actually, you sort of have a good idea of what you're going to do, and people are start, making art assets and probably, voice acting stories and all that sort of stuff, and people are sort of coding stuff up. How long did that period take? And were there any sort of major sort of challenges, or maybe sort of things you kind of thought you'd sort of solved in pre-production, then sort of in productions?
Yeah, during pre-production, well, when we started building Sunrise Village, we were focused purely on the simulation aspect and the farming simulation aspect of the game, so we hadn't really developed the story potential of Sunrise Village at that point. And it wasn't until after we went into development that we saw, hang on, the farming simulation alone with just a character gameplay, it wasn't really working, because the character didn't have that much relevance in the farming simulation. information. And this was the point when we talked about it. We went kind of we did some bigger changes to the game at that point, and we really sort of moved away from the focus being on the farming to the focus being on exploration. So that's when we started adding the levels. That's when we started like really fleshing out the story further and adding the quests. And all of that happened after pre-production. It wasn't during development. It was during development that we actually started doing that.
T, as a designer, is that the sort of thing that you spend your time designing this certain type of sort of game, and then suddenly all this other stuff has to be added in? Is that a bit sort of is that a bit sort of scary? It's suddenly, I guess you didn't have to redo all the work, but it's a different sort of it's a different sort of game at that point.
Sure, yeah. I mean, yeah, you do spend a lot of time working on this one idea. You get really married to it, and then of course, you pivot, and it was a pretty big pivot for the game. But and then the challenge there is kind of using what we had already built and kind of melting it into the system that we wanted to eventually have for the game. And so, I mean, that was a challenge on GD's side to make sure that, especially on the technical side of like the toolings and all that stuff. So yeah, it is a challenge, but it is part of the job, right? You have to kind of go with what works best. And sometimes that means pivoting, another direction. Yeah.
I still think it's the case where people sort of think that sort of someone comes up with a game design, and then sort of 6 months later this sort of perfect game sort of emerges, and people are always complaining, well, why didn't you make it quicker, sort of thing, or and they just think they're just so complicated. The more I learn about game development, is a lot of stuff gets made and maybe never sees the light of day, which we never know
absolutely.
about. Cool. So we sort of, I guess we're taking a chronological view. We're sort of moving through production, and I guess one of the interesting things about sort of free-to-play mobile games, or games with a sort of service element, is you have this, it might be quite a long production phase, and then you go into some sort of soft launch, which is, it starts off, you're basically putting a version of the game out there and just testing for sort of technical aspects, and then the various different things that people end up testing for, retention, monetization. But that again can be another period of time in which games experience quite significant changes, because that's sort of the first time you're getting, I guess like a public view of what's going on. So how did you approach soft launch, and how did that sort of play out?
Well, when we entered soft launch, we had a stability check essentially when we first went live. So this is just a short technical phase where we check that everything's working. We've got all of our analytics in place. We know where everything is kind of stable, and we don't have any critical bugs that we're seeing in the game. And that's the point where we start bringing in and looking for a few players to play the game and try it out. And then after that phase is gone, then that's when we start trying to bring in a few more players, and then we were able to really see, is this game really resonating with the audience? And that's the point when we're kind of all in there, we're fully committed. And at that point you have live players in the game. You've got getting hundreds or thousands of live players in the game, and it's very different to before live game development, because suddenly you have a player base that you need to maintain. So you can't start throwing away features anymore and then rebuilding them from scratch. You need to be conscious that you've got paying players even who are fully engaged with your game, and they have expectations, and the expectation is that we're able to deliver new features on a regular basis, new content on a regular basis, and we need to maintain the game accounts so that we don't completely break things for them, which is quite different to before you go into soft launch, where it's okay to break things during development. Once you go live, that's no longer the case. So it's a mindset change. It's a really big mindset change. You need to learn to slow down, really look at everything that you're adding to the game, really pay attention to the quality, and make sure that everything that you add is something that's going to be welcomed by players, and it's going to be in a really good working state.
Was that generally the case, or were there things that you could sort of because particularly in that early stage where the people who are playing the game don't really not been playing it for very long, I suppose they're not necessarily that sort of committed to it, and you don't maybe know, I guess you have an idea what sort of people you think might play the game, but you don't actually know until you've got some sort of data around who's actually playing it. Were there any surprises in that process?
There is always surprises when you go into soft launch in a game. things don't work out exactly the way you planned. You have like bugs that you didn't expect to find, and you find big issues on a new deployment that perhaps might send the game or create like serious issues in the game for players when you release new content, for example. And I think this is normal right in the early stages, but this is also why you don't immediately try and bring like hundreds of thousands or millions of players into the game. You need to work through those early stages of live game development cautiously, so that it is possible to maintain those players. And yes, they are important because they're the ones that are going to be the end of content players. They're the ones that are going to be the most advanced and able to give you that feedback later on, so that every player that follows afterwards will then be able to also benefit from those experiences and those learnings.
No, so that's quite a good point, isn't it? That those are going to be your sort of your day zero players, and if you can keep them engaged, they not only, I suppose, are they the starting of the community, if you have them, but they'll be the ones who get further through the game quicker than anyone else, and get to experience that, and then they can make even more sort of enthused, I suppose, as community members. Obviously, when soft launch is happening, Thi, the game designers are just sort of sitting around not doing anything because their job's done. So it's a nice easy period for you. No, so I assume not. So what's it like on the design side?
Yeah, and I was going to say that, yeah, you mean, you have your game, you've balanced it, you've created the system, you've done your calculations. We've had user tests before this, just kind of like testing out with a real audience how players would play through the first couple stages. We have kind of that data, and then your game goes out to the wild, and then of course, players act completely different, or they're blazing through the content much faster than you anticipated. So one of the challenges too for game design was like, oh man, we have to keep up with this content. We talked about these players sitting at the end, and that was kind of the challenge for game design, to ramp up our pipeline, our roadmap of that, right? So yeah, that was a big thing for game design.
There's always, it's like a nice problem to have, but I don't think I've ever heard one game developer sort of say that when they put the game out there, that they're not just amazed by the amount of time the real hardcore fans can throw at some of these products. I remember back in the days of before, when you had sort of box product, where they'd release the game, and by the next day people would be going, well, when's the sequel coming out? Finish that one. At least with mobile games, free-to-play games, you always have stuff coming out. But it is amazing how committed people are. Yeah. Teemu, what are your thoughts about this sort of process? I assume this is pretty standard.
Being a somewhat hardcore mobile gamer, I've played games where I've run out of content pretty soon. I can imagine it's super tough to balance for, say, a person like me who might end up in clearing all the content pretty quickly, and then also taking into account the new players that are not going so fast. So you really need to be able to meet the expectations of all sorts of players, and that can be tough.
And I guess not only are you an expert, you're sitting there with your company credit card, buying up all the hard currency and zooming through. So you're the worst case.
I wish that was the case, but no, we have to actually play the games for most part.
So monetization, I guess. I don't know, for some people maybe a dirty word, but one of the things about free-to-play mobile games is they're actually, I think, quite good in the sense, if you don't want to. Generally, the games are designed, if you don't want to sort of pay money, you can sort of just play through and progress it at that level. But obviously, some people want to spend. So, I guess from the design point of view, to begin with, how did you sort of approach monetization? And I guess maybe because some of your other games had been a bit more sort of hardcore, they could have been a feeling that they had a sort of different monetization sort of approach to maybe what this game would be. At least that would have been my thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think many mobile titles, like you mentioned, we're using the free-to-play model in terms of our monetization strategy. But for Sunrise Village, we want players to play for free and then pay if they actually really enjoy playing the game. So our approach is really that we don't want to monetize, for example, frustration, or we don't want to have any hard paywalls in the game. We want to have players really enjoying the game, get into the game, and then when a player, or if a player should decide that they would like to pay for the game, it should feel good. It should feel like they're getting some value for their money. So we're very careful when paying attention to the pricing in the game. We don't really, we want to make it feel accessible to all of our players, so they do feel like they're getting really good value.
And from a design point of view, Tay, was that were you taking actually are those sort of techniques you've learned through more hardcore games? Are they fine to sort of use maybe a bit more sparingly, or do you have to sort of rethink a little bit about sort of the value proposition and how you retail them?
Yeah, I think we have to come up with a different approach here because the audience is very different, and we don't want to drive them away with a more aggressive, monetization strategy where, in the competitive games, in the other games that we have in InnoGames, it works, right? Because players, when there's that competitive element, it's a different player set. For here, players are a little more casual. They really enjoy like the experience of the game more. And so, as Alison said, paying is more about, if you enjoy the game, do it, right? We also have this energy mechanic, and I think within the game design community within games, it was always been kind of a little like iffy kind of mechanic. I remember back in the day when this was introduced in Facebook games, it was like really hated on, and but the difference here is we provide a lot of other avenues within the game for players to continue playing, to continue to get the energy that lets them continue to explore, and if not that, then they can always go back to their village and play the game there. So even with that feature, we don't have this hard stop where players just need they just feel stuck. And then when we look at monetization features, for something like we just introduced something called the Golden Pass, there's a free lane there. You can participate in this sort of feature, and you get rewarded a lot. And the thing with our game is it's very rewarding. You go play through and you find that you get a lot of resources, you get a lot of energy back, you get a lot of all these nice consumable items that you can use to play your game. So yeah, that's always the focus, to make it as enjoyable, but have that option for players who want to get a little more.
Timo, you can tick off your battle pass mentioned there. We always like to see a battle pass mentioned, even if it's called Golden Pass. That's if we had a bingo card, we'd be stamping it now. It's good.
Battle Pass always works. It's super nice that you also find it useful.
Going back on one of the points you had there, T, is there isn't competition in this game. It's got a sort of collaborative sort of multiplayer sort of thing. So, and I guess they can, if they're set up in the sort of right way. Obviously, they're different sort of. It maybe appeal in different way to different sort of people, but they're both sort of, they're actually sort of two sides, they're different sides of the same coin of sort of social interaction. So was that like a fairly easy thing to implement? To have sort of collaborative elements?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we took learnings obviously again from our other games at InnoGames, and the multiplayer feature that we have. I mean, we do have something like a guild. We call it teams in the game, where players can come together, and they can. There's a weekly event that they can play with their team to earn points, and it is a bit of competition because you are competing against other teams. But from the feature, you also gain a lot of rewards for yourself, and ranking for your team. So if you do end up being able to rank, you can get more rewards. And it's also just something else for players to do, to just kind of chat with each other. I know in my team, we're always cheering on each other and, hey guys, let's unlock the next island, So yeah, it's just sort of this, collaborative, cooperative kind of game feature, even though it is a bit competitive as well.
So the game's been live for over 6 months now, but sort of you had a sort of commercial launch a bit earlier in 2022. So Alison, where are you sort of as a product, and what's sort of the rest of 2022 looking like in terms of the stuff you can talk about, I suppose, at least, and where the product's gonna go?
Yeah, well, I don't want to make any big promises right now, but yeah, I mean, we've been in commercial launch since February, and since then we've been expanding our events pipeline. So we've added 2 new types of events now. We've got a new event coming out at the end of the month. It's a special type event that is a little bit different to what we've done before. So we really hope the players will go for that. In terms of the rest of the year, well, we just released the Golden Pass for the first time, and like you mentioned, this is proving to be quite popular with players, and we need to continue building on that. But we also want to have a look again at our team explorations feature, so our main multiplayer feature. We see that players are really engaged with this, but we want to take it to a new level. We want to provide a few more challenges for players. Right now we only have one kind of island where players are playing through. We want to really expand on this, make it more engaging, more rewarding, also more challenging, to really increase the engagement there. So I think that is kind of a bit of an outlook for the rest of the year. But certainly it's going to be more events. It's going to be more features.
There always seems to be the balance between you get the regular sort of live ops of sort of sort of the things that are happening, whatever, sort of weekly or monthly, and then I guess the question is, at what point do you start adding some of these bigger features, which I think sometimes can be, for some of the games I've played, can be a little bit Marmite. So some players really like them, but other players, if they don't like them so much, that almost gives them like an opportunity to churn out, which I imagine is very difficult for a game developer to sort of balance that, because probably anything you do in the game is going to annoy some people and make other people happy, and so there's not an easy solution to that sort of problem. But anyway, Teemu, any final thoughts? Where do we think can we get any more hybridization, any more mixing of genres, do you think?
Hybridization is always good, like the crafting element. Crafting games are really popular, even like, in mid-core they had the last year's big success, Cookie Run Kingdom. That's also like a crafting game and auto battle RPG mixed together, so hybridization is always good. And then one thing that also came to mind is taking care of your both free players and paying players. You mentioned that your Golden Pass is very generous to players, and I remember having played a lot of these Japanese mobile games. They just throw free stuff at you all the time, and they make you feel really welcome at the game. And at least for me, that helped really return to some of those games. You felt like you're cared for, and you're not just kind of the paying customer that they are looking for. So really great to hear that Sunrise Village is looking after all of its players.
Conclusion there: more free stuff is what I'm hearing.
Might be a personal preference also, but it seems to work.
Of course, the game designer's like, well, we've got massive inflation. We're giving away loads of free stuff. That's messed up all my careful balancing that I spent years doing. Well, thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much, Teemu. Thank you very much, Tay, for your conversation. Obviously, thank you very much you for watching and listening, however you are consuming our podcast. So every time we are talking to the people who are building out the free-to-play sort of mobile sector, obviously the biggest sector in gaming by far now, and really delivering excitement and joy to 3 billion people playing mobile games now, by far and away the biggest audience of any sort of game. So thank you very much. I hope you all enjoyed that. Don't forget to obviously download Sunrise Village for Android and iOS, and let us know your thoughts. But thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe. Come back next time. Goodbye.